Hello, everyone. How's everyone this evening? Let me unmute you so you can tell me. Oh, hello, Lucy. Well, how's everything going tonight?
Good.
Good. Let me unmute everybody.
Yeah, going good.
Good. So, thank you, those who were able to send in your sources, and I will look at them and let you know if I have any questions or problems, or I should say you do. But so far so good. And any other issues, questions? Yes, Tessa.
Were we supposed to email those to you or
Yes,
post
yeah.
them? Okay.
Yeah, I have found Blackboard to be really cumbersome as far as putting ways to assign, have you
Okay.
post things. So rather than do that, I'm just having you email papers to me. Okay, so if you have a professor who's figured out how to make Blackboard work effectively, let me know. I'm happy to try to do that. But um, it seems to me that it's a lot of work to learn something that's, I could be, well, I'm a very lazy person, as you've probably figured out. And so if it's something becomes too complicated, I lose interest in it and say, well, let someone else figure this out. I'll just go back to the old fashioned way. So you're kind of fortunate that I'm not having you actually type out papers and hand them to me, which was the old fashioned way for a long time. Should we even call things papers anymore, since very rarely do you write something on a piece of paper. But that's, I guess, a philosophical question. And one day people will wonder why they call these papers. Because, so that's, I guess, a subject for your children and grandchildren to be figuring out. Looking back, tell them how you used to write papers and they'll wonder because, anyway, now I really am rambling. Next week, we're going to have another guest, and that is Darius Coombs from Mashpee. He is the director of Wampanoag Education at Plymouth. What used to be Plymouth Plantation is now Plymouth Patuxet. And I believe his wife will also be joining us, and she's been involved with the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project. So that should be interesting. Good. And this week, alas, it's just me. And so we'll be talking about a couple of things. One more about the Sioux Uprising, how it ended. I think I left you hanging last week. And then we'll talk about the Navajo. We're really very interesting folks. So, okay, good. So let's see where to begin. Where did we leave off with the Sioux? Did we finish? And you've heard enough about the Sioux. You want to hear no more.
I think we were just about when you were talking about an attempt of the Sioux to force all the white people out of the river valley. That's what I have written in my notes. So if that makes sense, I think
That
that's
does
where
make
we
sense
should
because
start.
that is what they were trying to do. Anyone else have any recollection of the Sioux and their uprising? See, I always proceed with this idea that I'm presenting you a seamless narrative and you're holding in your hand all of these component parts to it. The way if you're watching, say, a TV miniseries or something, you can remember from week to week what all of the different Real Housewives have been doing and their personality struggles and so on. And so it makes, when one of them does something, it fits in. And so I kind of approach this in very much the same way. That all of these characters you're holding in your heads and from week to week, following them intently. Maybe Real Housewives was the wrong analogy. It's somewhere between Real Housewives and a Russian novel. Okay, so that's kind of the general idea. And I hope with one of those two references, it gives everyone something to which they can plug in and understand. So Sioux trying to drive the whites out of the river valley, and anything else? I think I'm going to ask Lucy from every week just to kind of summarize what it was we did last week. And that was very helpful because often I can ramble on for hours and not really get to the point. So that is what's happening in the early 1860s. And the Sioux very nearly succeed in doing this. In fact, in this uprising, they kill something like 800 whites in southern Minnesota, and do seem to take possession again of this territory. And when the government sends reinforcements to the military support, the Sioux managed to hold them off and fight off this attempt to drive them out of this river valley. And then their last stand, though, is they're betrayed, discovered, and their presence is discovered. Other Indians who are not allied with the Sioux support the government, and the troops who were sent to Minnesota in the fall of 1862 are able to round up the ringleaders. Well, about 300 or 400 ringleaders, warriors, and actually the army has come to drive the Sioux out of Minnesota, and 300 warriors then are tried by court-martial and actually sentenced to death. And the President Lincoln reduces the sentences for all but 38. That is, not having them convicted of treason, levying war against the United States, but these are people who were accused of various atrocities, rape and murder, as opposed to killing a combatant, killing a non-combatant. And 38 Sioux are hanged on the 26th of December, 1862. This is actually the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. And the Sioux, some of the Sioux who had been driven out of Minnesota do go north to Canada, and others go further out on the prairies. And other Indians who had been in Minnesota and in Wisconsin, the Winnebagos notably, also are forced out. And so the Sioux Uprising in 1862 is, it comes in the midst of the Civil War, and its connection with the Civil War is kind of interesting, suggestive, not really conclusive. You know, there was a desire by the Confederacy to establish, to have the northwestern states of the United States break off from the Union. And this fails, but it is an attempt. And there might, the Sioux really were the driving force here and was not Confederate agents. But that's what's going on here. There's something similar happening further west on the plains among the Cheyenne. And I'll come back and talk about it later on. But one thing you see happening in this period is greater pressure on the plains. And the Cheyenne, whom I think I talked about a couple of weeks ago, very complicated political structure among the Cheyenne. And some of the Cheyenne were at peace with the United States, others were not. And in Colorado, a couple of the leaders of the Cheyenne, more pro-American than not, led by Black Kettle and White Antelope, come to Fort Lyon, and about 40 miles away, they camp about 40 miles away at a place called Sand Creek. And their camp is attacked by a Colonel Shivington. And I was just reading an article I'll send to you that says Colonel Shivington may well have been the worst military leader in the history of military leaders. And I don't think they were necessarily evaluating him as a military leader. I think they didn't like him for a lot of other reasons, which are understandable. He was court-martialed shortly after this. He's also a Methodist preacher, and I have nothing against Methodists. If any of you is a Methodist, I'm not going to start holding you to account for Colonel Shivington. He attacks this camp at Sand Creek, and the camp was flying both an American flag and a white flag, symbolizing we're at peace, we love the Americans. And Shivington attacks, and most of the people in the camp are actually women and children. And somewhere between 100 and 800 of the people in the camp are killed. And the soldiers then display the scalps when they get back to Denver. Denver, of course, had been at one time an Arapaho camp, and now it is becoming a city. And of course, the soldiers initially tell the story of this great fight they've had, putting down this Indian uprising. then other soldiers do tell the truth, that it really was. Some of the commanding officers actually forbid their men to fire. One of the commanders who forbids his men to fire is later assassinated in Denver because he then is one saying, we were really massacring women and children. In fact, the soldiers are displaying scalps in Denver of the warriors they captured, and are actually women or children's scalps that they're displaying. And these soldiers captured something like 500 horses, but curiously, none of the horses was turned over to the government. So this seems like just a mass looting as opposed to a legitimate battle. So you have the Sioux Uprising put down with force, and then you have the Sand Creek Massacre, as it's called, here on the plains. And we'll come back to this in a bit, because before, I talk more about the plains, I wanted to turn our attention to another part of the country, and that is the Southwest. And notably, we'll be talking about the Apache, the Navajo. And I'm sure someone's noting, he can't even remember who he's planning to talk about from one moment to the next. So, okay, the Navajo and the Apache actually are related. And this roughly is the area we will be talking about. And you have this area of the country is geographically different from the rest of the country in terms of its terrain, topography, and so on. And also, it has a much different history. At the time the United States arrives out here in the 1840s, that is, taking possession of this territory after the Mexican War, the people in this area already had a long experience with other colonial powers, notably the Spanish. In fact, the Spanish had arrived long before the English, and in the early 1600s, the Spanish had moved up the Rio Grande, as it is called. Long, interesting stories about the Spanish looking for the lost cities of gold, but that's really not the entire history, because I said, I promised you I'm going to talk about the Navajo. And the Navajo have their own story about how they arrived here. And in fact, their story is written down in a book. They developed they transliterated their language using the Latin alphabet, so that, and then have written down many of their stories, some of which I sent to you, and we'll be talking about them later on. The Dine Bahane is their account of their creation, how these people emerged through the 4 levels of the underworld, and the creation, the various characters involved, and how the people then emerged. And Dine is the people, and their longer name they call themselves is actually the holy people, because these are a holy people, and they emerged really in this general area, roughly between Devensa in Colorado, up out here, and Mount Taylor in New Mexico, which I believe is right around here, and the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona, which are roughly here, and then to the east, either Blanca Peak or Emez in New Mexico. So this, again, they define themselves as having emerged into the world here. And great stories, by the way, in the Dine Bahane about the heroic period of creation. An ever-changing woman is the central character in this, or changing woman, she is sometimes called. Yes, Trevor, you have a question?
I had a question. So you said they call themselves the holy people. Is that like similar to like the Bible calling Jewish people the holy people, where like a
Yeah.
different group of people wouldn't call them that? Like, would the Sioux call the Navajo?
Exactly. No, no, no. They wouldn't call them the chosen people because,
Okay.
perhaps many people do call themselves a chosen people, but these are the two examples that come most readily to mind. These are the holy people who were created in this way, in a similar way to the Bible tells us about these people created, the creation, and then all derived from them. So this is, yes, it's a good question. And in this case, very good question. The other people don't call them that. I should have told you something about that because the word Navajo actually means the cultivated fields by the ravine. And this is what the people who live along the Colorado River called them. These people, by the way, call themselves lots of different names, but the Spanish gave them the general name of Pueblo, which of course also means people, because the Spanish asked them, "Who are you?" And they said, "Well, we're the people." And they said, "Well, who are they?" And they said, "Well, those are the strangers." The Apaches do Navajo mean strangers of the cultivated earth. And again, this becomes a little bit complicated because also here's another thing about the Navajo. Their language is not related to any of the other languages spoken in this area, which suggests one of two things. I should ask you, what do you think it suggests?
Maybe like cultural isolation from other places.
It could be cultural isolation from other places. Yes, Trevor?
Migration from a different part.
Yeah, it could be that someone migrated into this area, either the Navajo and the Apache or someone else. And again, but I've just told you their story is that this is where we were created. And there is a lot of evidence, archaeological evidence, linguistic evidence, that that's not true. And so I'm not saying the Navajo are making it all up, but it's something about the way we do create histories, and which is what they do. And I mentioned that their history, the Dine Bahane, is a holy book, but it also is a story of who they are. And Changing Woman, I should say, has two sons, two warrior sons, Monster Slayer and Child of the Water. And in the Dine Bahane, by the way, this is something that was written down after many centuries of being told. And there is a certain structure to an oral narrative, which makes it something you can repeat and tell, a story you tell, and people might tell in different ways. And then when someone does write it down, it becomes somewhat frozen in time. I was just reading this afternoon a website that had different accounts of the Dine Bahane, and they didn't like one particular version of it. And so there's controversy about what is the version. Yeah, similar to the Bible too, was written down, and the Quran written down, and you have these things that are written down, and then that gives them certain unchangeableness to them. So anyway, Changing Woman's warrior sons kill the evil spirits, and then the animals take form, and then Changing Woman is sent to live in the West so that she can receive the setting sun in her turquoise house on the Western Sea. Again, conscious of the fact there is a Western Sea where the sun sets, and that's where Changing Woman is gone. Now, because she thought she would be lonely in her turquoise house, she created people, 4 clans, actually from different parts of her body. And this version of the story, and again, the Bible also has different versions of the creation. This version of the story has people then migrating from the Western Sea back to Navajo land. So you have, initially we were created here, this is where Changing Woman came out of the earth, and then she went west, created people, we came here. Now, there is another version of the creation story that has the Tall House people being the first ones created. And it's a brother and sister created from ears of corn. And their spouses come from among the gods. And these are kilted figures in the story very much like the Pueblo dancers. We'll talk a little bit about the Pueblo in a bit. And the Tall House people are joined by various others. And one thing all creation stories have to take into account is how there are other people here too. If we're the ones who are created, where'd the other people come from? And this is what this is trying to do. Okay, so this is, well, very confusing here. I should say there is some evidence, linguistic evidence, that they might have come from further north. The Navajo language is related to the Athabascan language, the one spoken in the furthest north reaches of North America. And they have certain words that they share. For example, the word that the Navajo would use to describe an owl gliding across the sky is the same word which in the far north, in completely different people, would use to describe a canoe being paddled across a placid lake. There aren't that many placid lakes in the Navajo country. And there also is some archaeological evidence that the earliest known found structures of the Navajo, their houses, which would date to about almost 800 years ago, are similar to the structures being built in the far north. Again, it's suggestive evidence. The word for, the Navajo word for corn, and corn is a staple crop among most Native people, actually means the food of strangers. So this is not something they would have had before they came to this area or moved down. So long process of migration was there. The Navajo story, and again, another thing that is really central to Navajo identity, two animals, sheep and horses. Sheep are essential for weaving the wool they create, but both of these were introduced by the Spanish. So before 1500, at the earliest, there would not have been sheep or horses in this territory. Okay. Here's what we do know from, or suspect from archaeological evidence. Much of what we're still learning all kinds of things about this area. Sometime about 1100 AD, the farmers along the Colorado River started concentrating in larger towns. They had been kind of dispersed throughout the the upper Rio Grande River Valley. Tessa's marking down. I keeps mistaking the rivers. Good. Okay. So the upper Rio Grande, they start living in concentrated villages, the cliff dwellings, places like Mesa Verde. And between 1100 and 1400, there seems to be a lot of movement between from southern Arizona into Colorado, that is moving north. And the Pueblo people are moving into villages. By the way, the Pueblo people actually are about 7 or 8 unrelated groups. Their languages are mutually unintelligible, and in fact, each of their languages is its own language family. So the Hopi, the Zuni, the Taos, the people who live in these distinctive pueblos had been more dispersed, but then they come to be concentrated. They have relatively similar ways of life because they're living in this similar geographic area. They have been practicing farming, raising corn and beans and squash in the relatively fertile upper Rio Grande. And by the way, here is the important fact for you to learn tonight. In Texas, they call it the Rio Grande. Other places call it the Rio Grande. And so do with that information what you will. I've been chastised by people from both places because I have mispronounced it, not pronounced it the way they like to say it. So if you have a favorite pronunciation for the river which forms the border between the United States and Mexico, you're free to continue using it. I'm not going to mark you down if you don't pronounce it the way I do. I won't mark you down if you don't pronounce anything the way I do. As I think I probably have explained, when you spend your formative years in New Jersey, you spend the rest of your life overcoming your mispronunciations of things. So by 1500, there are about 60 to 70 towns along the upper Rio Grande, and each has somewhere between 400 and 2,000 people. And possibly the total population here is about 40,000. There's no organization linking these different towns together. Each one is a self-contained, self-governing entity that's probably been forced into this fortification between 1100 and 1500 because of the arrival of the Apache and the Navajo, who come into this area and begin raiding and doing other things to make these folks move in and fortify themselves. And so there is no written historical record of this. There is this other evidence. There's also evidence people have been looking at the changes in the climate in this area. Because as you can see, as you probably know, it is a dry climate. By the way, has anyone been to this area? The area of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah? Wow, no one wants to admit it. Yeah, beautiful country, very much, very different, and well worth visiting. One of the stories I did not send you was actually a Navajo story about astronauts, that in preparation for the moon landing, NASA was training a couple of astronauts in this area that looks very much like the surface of the moon. And so they have their space module set up, and they have a couple of the astronauts are there, and there is a Navajo farmer and his son. The son is a young man, and the old Navajo farmer and the son were curious, and the man working with the astronauts comes to explain, oh, we're here, men going to the moon, and that, and then he thinks, wouldn't it be a great idea to have this Navajo man give a message that then could be broadcast by this first man on the moon? And so they asked. The old man can only speak Navajo. And by the way, Navajo is the native language with the most speakers to this day. And so the old man says something into the tape recorder, and the NASA man says to the younger Navajo, what did he say? He said, you wouldn't tell him. But the NASA thinks it's great. We'll carry this message from the Navajo to the moon. And it is translated, the story goes later, when the Navajo hear it, the old man had said, watch out for these people, they're coming to take your land. So, anyway, we see the Spanish moved into the upper Rio Grande in the 1600s, and long story that I won't detain you with culminates in actually, initially, the native people in these pueblos welcome the Spanish. The Spanish are looking for the cities of gold. And much of this story is trying to find these cities of gold that they hear are somewhere up here. And they're not. And the Spanish do wind up setting up missions in these towns. And the Pueblo people kind of accept the Spanish because the Spanish will be their allies against the Navajo and the Apache, who are raiding them. And the Spanish are. And the Navajo and the Apache raid now the Spanish for their horses and continue raiding. The Spanish try to dissuade the Navajo and Apache from raiding unsuccessfully, and they do tighten up their restrictions on the Pueblo people, which leads in 1680 to the Pueblo revolting against the Spanish, actually driving all of the Spanish out of the upper Rio Grande. And the Spanish do come back about 10 years later, but they've learned something from this experience. And one is to get along better with the native people, which they do. And so the Spanish do get along better with the native people than they had previously, and particularly the Pueblo people. The Pueblo revolt had also sent many of the Pueblo to live among the Navajo, who had been their traditional enemies. The Western Pueblo or the Hopi continue to resist the Spanish, and Spain cannot subdue them easily. The Eastern Pueblo, recognized by Spain, had settled in these towns along the upper Rio Grande, producing corn, beans, and squash, an agricultural way of life, living in villages, as opposed to the Navajo and the Apache, who are out in the wild. Although the Navajo are living in, they're planting, they have a fertile area, but the perception here among the Spanish is the Navajo and the Apache are the wild Indians, the Pueblo are the civilized Indians, the agricultural ones, and the peaceful Indians. And you have both Mexican American and Anglo-Americans settling in the area, encroaching and getting along in an interesting way. Now, things do begin to change in the 19th century. In the 1820s, American trappers began coming into the Southwest to trap along the Gila River, licensed actually by Santa Fe. Santa Fe in New Mexico, largest city in the area. Let me just go back to our slideshow. So Santa Fe would be somewhere in, it's on the upper Rio Grande, somewhere around here. Someone here can probably see where Santa Fe is. Here it is. And so you have the big town here. And in fact, it becomes really a trading center. It had long been a trading post. Here you can see the Santa Fe Trail heading toward it. And then there are other trails going west and south. This is the Gila River in what is today southern Arizona and New Mexico. And the trappers come out here in the 1820s, licensed by Santa Fe, the trading company in operation there. And Apaches attack them in the 1820s, killing about 20 of these trappers. And it's a dangerous area. I think there's that understanding. Later on, some Anglos lease silver mines from the Spanish authorities. Actually, now by this time, Mexican authorities. Mexico has fought a war against Spain. And so this area is part of Mexico. And the Anglos now are leasing silver mines, making treaties with the locals, and Apaches raid into Sonora and Chihuahua in Mexico, these Mexican states here, and Chihuahua and Sonora, the governments there, give bounties for Apache scalps. And an Englishman named Johnson, he might actually have been an American, it's ambiguous. This is a frontier area. And you have lots of people moving in for the purpose of getting rich, to find gold or silver, just as the Spanish were trying to find gold or silver. And you have these native people who have been there for a long time. And it's really a tough area. The Navajo have a relatively fertile area in the northern part of the territory up here, but much of the rest, it's desert, and it can only sustain a small number of people. And the Apache really sustain themselves by, raiding for horses along the upper Rio Grande, raiding the various trappers here along the Gila River, or people coming through with a wagon load or ox carts and so on. And in this particular case, this Englishman or American named Johnson actually turns a howitzer onto a group of peaceful Apaches and kills a number of them. And then this leads other Apaches to come and attack. And so you have this fighting going on between the Apache and these various folks coming into this territory. And in between the 1800s and the 1840s, the Apaches and the Navajo have pretty much prevented any white encroachment into this area. The risk seems to be too big. And the Navajo are among the most dreaded of the warriors in this area. Now, the Apache focus is going to be here. The Navajo focus is going to be more here and this way, north toward the plateau of Colorado and Utah. And Utah, of course, gets its name from the Ute, the native people of that area, Ute, Paiute, people who lived in an even more forbidding climate. And the Navajo would raid them for the purpose of getting slaves that they then could sell either to the Spanish or to the Pueblo Indians here. And, you know, the Navajo, both through their agriculture and through their raiding, are really making themselves a dominant force here in this area. And they've elaborated, they have real opportunities here to raid for horses and for slaves. And if you have horses, this gives you a better capacity to get slaves from the people further north who don't have horses. And the long stories about using the various ceremonies, you know, attacking Hopis and Zunis, carrying off children and scalps. So one reason they, of course, most Native people when they raid are going to get children, as children then can be raised into the group, as well as corn and sheep. And in the spring, the Navajo would go hunt Paiutes, whose food supply were depleted by then, and then the Apaches and the Utes and the Navajo would then trade these slaves for horses. The Utes, the people of what is today Utah, never had taken up agriculture or sheep raising. And the Navajo would keep their women as servants or as wives and mistresses. The men who were captured often would be castrated and have their ears marked. And at the same time, the whites who were the Anglos who were coming into this area, as well as the Mexicans coming to this area, are also trading in Indian slaves. It's estimated that in the 1830s, something like there were somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 Indian slaves in the New Mexico territory, and about 3/4 of them were Navajo. So the Navajo are capturing slaves from among the Utes. The Anglos are capturing slaves from among the Navajo. And so you have this complicated series of arrangements here. Anyway, in the by the 1840s, New Mexicans and Pueblos are being raided, are raiding for horses and slaves among the Navajo. And in the late 1840s, of course, the whole political dynamic is going to change with the arrival of Americans, with the peace with Mexico. And the Americans have a peace conference, because here all of these native people, the Pueblo, the Ute, the Paiute, the Apache, the Navajo, have been fighting each other. And the Americans, as we remember from Fort Laramie, and you probably should just remember generally, don't like it when people fight each other. And so they want to bring everyone together, one big happy family, and let's stop these raids on each other. And, you know, this is, by the way, here's a Navajo woman weaving. As I said, sheep are really essential, because the Navajo the women become very good weavers. And according to the story, it was Spider Woman, who's another of the characters in the Dine Bahane, teaches a young Navajo girl how to weave. And the Navajo do really extraordinary work with primarily wool and, you know, dyes, but also they will are trading for cloth too. So red cloth often does come from Great Britain, where it will be taken apart and then rewoven into this fabric. So it's really it's an extraordinarily highly skilled thing, you know, weaving blankets like this. And by the early 19th century, these Navajo blankets are used as a form of wealth and prestige throughout the Great Plains, basically from Mexico to Canada. Chiefs would wear a blanket, a Navajo blanket. You can see this woman also is draped in, you know, Navajo weaving. But it takes considerable skill to do these patterns. and also a considerable amount of time. And here's another pattern. You can see the horses, and it's a ladder. There's symbolism in here. Now, here's a Navajo farmer. Again, they live in a fertile area. The background I have is the Canyon de Chile in northern Arizona. See, it's the river has brought the land down, and so there's this very fertile area in this canyon where they grow fruit trees as well as cultivating other things. So the leader of the Navajo at this time is well, I thought I had a picture of the leader of the Navajo at this time. Yes, Narbona. He was born about 10 years before the American Revolution. So by the 1840s, he is about 80 years old. And he attends the peace conference that the Americans have summoned. And he really can't understand why the Americans had been fighting against many of these people, and now they want to ally themselves with these people. You know, the New Mexicans had, before the war, that is, the people in New Mexico had been enemies both of the Navajo and of the Americans, and now the Americans want all of them to be one big happy family. And this makes absolutely no sense to Narbona. Why are you trying to make these alliances with people who've always been your enemies? In fact, the Navajo take the opportunity of this peace conference, knowing that the leaders of the Pueblo are away at the peace conference, actually to raid the Pueblos, knowing that their places are unprotected. And as I said, wondering why they're doing this. And the Apaches also wonder about this strategy. And also the treaty that the United States made with Mexico at the end of the Mexican War also calls for the United States to stop the Apaches from raiding south of what is now the United States border. You know, the Apaches would have raided anywhere, but now the Americans, having fought this war against Mexico, promised to Mexico that we're going to prevent the Apache from raiding you. So some Apaches do sign treaties or agreements and settle down to start farming and accepting government aid. That is, the Apache operate in relatively small bands, you know, unlike the Navajo, who have a fairly big political structure. And the Apache operate in smaller bands. And some of them do make peace, and some of them make peace with the Americans, but say, well, we didn't make peace with the Mexicans, so we can still raid south of the Mexican border. And the Americans say, well, no, you can't raid south of the Mexican border. And the Apaches then say, well, what's the point of being at peace if we can't keep doing what we're doing? And some Apaches are ready to grant permission for whites to use their land in return for a payment, but they're not ready to give up raiding into Mexico. And in 1861, a group of the Chiricahuas have a Mexican captive. An American lieutenant seizes their leader, whose name was Cochise, because the Americans don't want the Apaches raiding into Mexico. And Cochise escaped. The other Apache leaders then were murdered. Cochise then kills an Anglo trader, and he also raids the overland mail. the United States had set up a mail coach traveling across this area to California. And Cochise raids the overland mail. I should tell you, raiding the United States mail is a certain way to get the attention of the United States government, and it will bring its full force to make sure that the mail goes through. And so a war breaks out here among the Navajo and the Apache against the United States. But of course, this is in 1861, and yes, the full force of the United States is going to be brought to bear on the Apache and the Navajo for disrupting the mail. But meanwhile, you have this civil war going on, which distracts the United States temporarily from this. However, in this period, continues to be warfare among the Apache, the Navajo, and the various whites who are in the area, particularly after gold is discovered in Arizona. And there is a treaty made in 1863. Actually, some of the Indians are brought to hold a treaty in southern Arizona at a place called Miami. And there, the people who had invited them to the treaty actually poisoned the Indians. And the Arizona Territorial Legislature in 1863 calls for exterminating the Indians from the territory. Now, the Navajo agreed to stop raiding in this period, though it's becoming a very bloody period here. And you have all kinds of bad things happening. So a colonel named John Washington comes to make a treaty. Some Mexicans who were there spot some horses among the Navajo that they say are stolen. Actually, one stolen horse. And Colonel Washington demands that the Navajo return the horse. The Navajo refuse. The lieutenant goes to get the horse. The Navajo turn and ride away. And one of the guards fires, and among those killed is Narbona, the chief of the Navajo. Now, the Navajo adopt a similar strategy when they're fighting, whether they're fighting Americans, whether they're fighting Pueblos or Spanish or anyone else. And that is, when it is convenient, you'll fight. When it's not convenient, you'll escape through trickery. And in fact, in the Navajo stories, one of the central characters is the coyote, who is the trickster. Who is always, it's actually a motif in stories of the trickster, someone who is playing with others, and that is the coyote. And so this is very much a Navajo strategy. So in this case, an American army comes through the mountains to fight the Navajo, led to them by Pueblo scouts. Remember, the Pueblo and the Navajo traditionally had been enemies. And the Navajo strategy is, when the enemy is there in force, you leave the enemy alone. Instead, what you will do is stage raids on the enemy. And this is what the Navajo do. So, big enemy force coming. No, we're not going to fight them. Instead, we will let these soldiers come into the Canyon de Chelly, meet different leaders here, and the Navajo agree they're going to give up captives, etc. And the whites actually build a fort at the entrance to the canyon. Let's see if I have an image of this. Yeah. So this is the original homeland and Fort Defiance, built at the entrance to the canyon. And the Americans also make alliances with the Zunis, the Utes, other old Navajo enemies. So the Navajos really are caught now between their traditional old enemies, their new enemies, that is the Utes, the Zunis, and the Americans. And they try to attack the fort. A blacksmith inside the fort. The Navajo blacksmith is inside the fort. Navajo, who's become a blacksmith, works in the fort. And Navajo watchman gives a signal, but then The fort fires a cannon, the Navajo scatter, knowing better than to attack a heavily fortified position that's using artillery. And then a white army comes to clear out the Navajo, who start to make truces, but then the whites are distracted by the Civil War. Now, someone did describe this country where all of this is happening as like a madhouse where everyone is armed. You have all of these different native groups who are warriors who have been fighting against each other. And then you have the entrance of Americans also armed, and some of them in the person of the army and some in the person of traders, guys looking for gold, etc. And our friend Colonel Washington decides he is going to act, and he gets an order that he has to restore. He gets an order that he has to restore some kind of semblance of order in this area. And so first what he is going to do is kill the Apache men and take the women and children prisoner. And the Navajos also are going to be suppressed, and they're going to be forced to give up raiding and fighting. The New Mexico territory raises its militia, led by, so New Mexico, one territory. New Mexico has a more stable population than Arizona. New Mexico, the Rio Grande flows through it, fertile area. There's been people practicing agriculture there for 1,000 years. Arizona, much different, much more difficult terrain. And the Navajo up here have been practicing agriculture, but also practicing raiding and raising sheep. So if you're going to restore order here, it is going to need something of a military force. And so about 700 men, led by Kit Carson, a famous guy in this era, go to round up the Apaches. And by March of 1863, he has rounded up about 400 Mescalero Apaches being held at Fort Sumner in New Mexico, right about here. And Carson only kills about 50 Indians during this entire campaign, but he is quite successful at getting the Apache to surrender. And he gets the Apache to surrender by destroying their crops. And he does a similar thing with the Navajo, that is leading his forces, this force that he brings up here, into the Canyon de Chile and destroying the corn crops, cutting down the peach trees. And what he is really doing is forcing the Navajo to surrender, because now they have no way of feeding themselves. He's eliminated their ability to feed them. He pursues them up into the canyon, and the Navajo actually face this really somber choice. They can surrender to Carson, and then they'll be sent here to Fort Sumner. If they surrender to the Hopi or the Ute, their traditional enemies, they'll either be killed or sold as slaves. In the 1940s, that is about 80 years after this happened, a Navajo man told an interviewer the story of his mother's capture in this period. His father and the father's two wives were riding to Fort Defiance so that they could surrender to the Anglos. And his younger wife had with her her 5-year-old daughter and a baby on a cradle board. And near Holbrook, Arizona, a group of Hopi, Zuni, and Mexicans came galloping up to this party of Navajo coming to surrender. And the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Mexicans captured all their livestock. They killed all the men, and then they took the women to be sold as slaves. And the baby on the cradle board was thrown off a cliff, because a baby is going to slow things down. And the mother, who had just lost the baby, is able to sneak out of the camp at night, and she makes it to Fort Defiance to surrender, which she does. And this begins for the Navajo in 1863 and early 1864. One of the really central facets of their life, after the emergence into the world, and this is what they call the long walk. That is, they've surrendered at Fort Defiance. They've had their central area, the Canyon de Chile, devastated by the Anglos. And now, having surrendered, they then have to walk from Fort Defiance to Fort Sumner. It's about a 300-mile walk, and 2,400 of them are relocated to Fort Defiance, actually clearing all of the Navajo out of this territory. General Carleton, who was the general in charge of the operation, his plan is to make the Navajo a happy and contented people. And they are given about 40 square miles of land here on the upper Pecos River. This is the Pecos. And unfortunately, it's not really good area for farming. And, so Carleton's idea, this is a persistent idea that Americans have had, is let's get the Indians to settle down and become farmers. But they're doing this in an area which really isn't good for farming. And the Navajo also, there's only one man who can tell the Navajo what the United States wanted them to do, because no one else can speak the Navajo language. And this is a fellow from Mexico who had been captured as a child by the Utes, then sold to the Navajos, Jesus Avizo, who's a Mexican who can speak both Spanish and Navajo. So he is translating for the Navajo from English into Spanish into Navajo. And they've arrived in this area where the Apaches already have the better land. They're on the land along the river, and they have an irrigation ditch. And what happens is the Navajos push them off, and which is what the Navajos do. And the mescaleros leave, but then what they plant, caterpillars destroy. It's really an ordeal, a saga of bad years. The caterpillars one year, floods the next, then droughts, then rain, then smallpox, kills about 2,000 of the Navajo. And for the Navajo, all of this has a simple explanation. They've been moved to this different place, away from where they traditionally had been, where they were created, and they're not able to practice their traditional rites, rituals. As with most Native people, everything has a ritual attached to it. And so the Navajo explain that their bad luck is really caused by leaving their sacred land. And they're never going to survive outside of their sacred land. They do learn some things while they're here. One is to make metal dyes. That is, they learn a valuable skill in making metal dyes. And they use these metal dyes to forge their ration tickets. That is, if the government is putting you in this place, the government has to feed you. So the ration tickets are essential. And they also learn how to swim. And they also learn that the whites are here to stay. Remember, the Navajo had been in an area that was quite forbidding, hadn't seen very many white people coming into the area, and they'd only seen about 400 or so soldiers. And so they thought this is all that the whites have, about 400 soldiers. Now they learn there are more. And they also learn about the corruption of Indian agents. And the Indian agents and commissioners have been sent out here to feed and clothe the Navajos, and of about $100,000 appropriated by Congress to feed and support the Navajo, only about 30,000 got to the Navajos. And remember, the Navajos were very good weavers, but now they are dependent on the Indian agent to provide them with blankets. And so blankets are being sold to the Navajo, appraised at about $4.50. But actually, that's their value. But then the agent is actually charging the Navajo $22.50 for them. And in the first 18 months of this policy, 1864, 1865, it costs over $1 million just for the Army to house a couple thousand Navajo at Fort Defiant, Fort Sumner. And General William Tecumseh Sherman said it would have been better to send them to the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Civilians are asking for hundreds of thousands of dollars to take care of these Indians. And so you have here a big problem for the United States. Again, I've just made out this whole story of devastation of Indian people, and now I tell you a big problem for the United States. It legitimately is a bit serious problem. Because you had the Sioux Uprising, you had the Sand Creek Massacre, you have the Navajo, the Long Walk, and even though the idea is let's make them happy people, it doesn't seem to be working. We haven't really done it. And so there is some talk about, well, maybe we could send them to Oklahoma where the other Indians are, or to Arkansas, or maybe even back to northern Arizona. And the government really was set on sending them to Oklahoma because that's where we had sent the other Indians. And then a Navajo orator named Barboncito gives an impassioned plea to let us go back to our native country. And I should say, as with most native folks, the Navajo value eloquence. And one way you can become eloquent if you're worried about this is to put under your tongue a piece of turquoise that has live pollen on it. And this allows you to speak with eloquence. And so Barboncito, the name means he who runs forward, makes this impassioned plea. And in 1868, the United States government agrees, okay, let's let the Navajo go home if they agree to stop raiding. And so the Navajo agree, we'll stop raiding, and then they are allowed to go back to their home in the northeastern Arizona. Couple of things have brought about this change of policy on the part of the United States. The most important was the cost of the other policies the United States had had, but also it is because of the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant elected president in 1868. Remember, he had been the general who had won the war, and his inaugural address says, "Let us have peace." The United States just fought this really devastating war, and Grant wants peace. And among the North and South, among the Indians and whites, and Grant is going to change American Indian policy. General Sherman thinks the best thing to do would be to get the whites out of the territory, the Arizona territory, leave it to the Indians. And what happens in Arizona is, well, the Navajo territory isn't in an area that at the moment whites have their eyes on. So what we see happening here is the War Department devising this policy of Indian reservations far from white settlement. And at the same time, the War Department is going to round up those who are outside the reservation. And at this moment, that is 1868, the reservation system seems to be a humane solution to this problem. It's not going to be entirely, of course, but that's where we are. I didn't mean to have this long monologue about the Navajo and their travails in the 19th century. Are there any questions? I should have let you get a word in edgewise while I've been. How are you, Sana? Good to see you.
Sorry, I had to do a wine tasting for my job.
Wow, that sounds tough.
Sorry.
Okay. Well, let me see. I sent out earlier today a whole bunch of Navajo stories, and let me just see. I'm going to ask who read which ones, and then divide you up into groups. And well, let me just see. Who read? Did anyone read "The Coyote Helps Create Man and Woman"? You can use the raise hand feature.
I read that.
Molly read that. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Coyote Kills a Giant. You read that too, Molly?
No, I just read the.
Okay, your light went on, so I thought maybe you'd
Oh,
also read
sorry.
that one. Okay, no, I welcome overachievers. Okay, The Gambler. Anyone read The Gambler? Okay, story of the Cotsiti. Did anyone read any of the stories? Be honest. Okay,
I read Spider Rock.
You read Spider Rock. Is that Savannah?
Yes.
Okay, let me see if I can find that one. Okay, good.
I-
Anyone else read Spider Rock? I'm sorry, Shadi, what were you saying?
Well, I said I read the Monster Slayer.
Okay, good. Monster Slayer. Okay, good. Okay. Anyone read? Oh, Monster Slayer. Okay. Song of the Horses. Alex, did you? Your light went on.
No, I read The Boy Who Became a God.
Okay. Sounds like a good one. Okay. Legend of the Night Chant. Anyone read that one? Okay, Lucy did. I'm just trying to get a sense of what stories people read so we can have some focus. Song of the Horses. No one read that one, right? Rock Monster and Rock Monster Eagle and Monster Slayer. No. Oh, Hunter Harrison did. Okay.
Yep, and me too.
Good. Okay, let's see. Brother Cousins. Shadi, did you read Shadi, that one?
I read the Monster Slayer.
Yeah, okay, you didn't read Brother Cousins. First Man, First Woman. Rainbow's End. Tessa did. Okay, and Patrick. Okay, good. Changing Woman. No one read Changing Woman. The Gambler. Okay, so as I'm seeing this, we have one, two, three. Well, some stories only had one person reading them. So what I am going to do now is divide us up. Well, why don't we take a short break? And then when we come back, we'll divide up into groups. You can share with each other the story you read and talk about what it means, how we interpret it. And then we'll come back as a group and talk generally about what these stories tell us about the Navajo. Okay? So why don't we take like a 5-10 minute break, come back refreshed, and that'll give us all time to catch up on the stories that we just told everyone we've read. So good. Okay. So Jeff, what story did you read?
I read kind of like multiple ones, so.
Okay.
I,
Did any stand out?
I guess Legend of the Night Chant.
Okay. Why?
It just seemed the most interesting.
Okay, good. Lucy, what about you? What did you read?
I also read The Legend of the Night Chant.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else stand out? Anything stand out about it to you?
It's confusing and it didn't end the way I thought it was going to end.
I see.
I guess I'm very accustomed to like Aesop's fables. And so when it ended the way it did without anybody dying, I was like, wow, that was a good ending.
Well, okay, good. What about you, Jeff? Did you find it different or did you just
I guess kind of like Lucy, I was expecting someone to die at the end, but that didn't happen.
Okay. Sana, did you have a chance to read something?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I'm just gonna be honest with you. I thought we were working on our project. I had no idea we were supposed to read.
Yeah,
read
I also forgot you were working on your project. That's why I sent this assignment out. So
Yeah, so I apologize, but I'm just being honest with you, Professor
okay,
Allison.
that's okay. Okay, good. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I will read it after we get out of class.
Read a story. Okay, good, good.
Ugh. With school and like work, it's so overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I know, I mean, it's not an excuse, but I'm just, well, it's a lot.
Yeah. Well, I understand that.
Like when I lived in Kansas, I was like staying with my parents and I worked part-time. So I had all the time to like focus on my school. And this is honestly, I'm 39 and this is like the first time, I'm not kidding, because I was always codependent in my relationships. This is the first time I'm like living in an expensive city, working a normal job and doing school. It's crazy. It's crazy. Yeah. Yeah, it's insane.
Okay. I had two people who read At the Rainbow's End. Who were they? Wasn't Jeff and Lucy too? No.
I did.
I did too.
Let me see. I wasn't catching who that was.
I did.
And I'm sorry. I'm seeing something else in front of me. Okay, Tessa, you read that, and Patrick. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Okay, I'm going to open the rooms and send you to them. So, Okay, what did we learn about the Navajo from reading these stories? Anything? Sometimes a story is just a story. Yes, Trevor.
It seems like they put like a high value on like the warrior culture.
Okay. Which story did you read?
Brother, cousin, something like that.
Okay. And did anyone else find a high value on warrior culture in the story they read?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, mine was about Monster Slayer killing the rock monster eagle, so I kind of got that as well.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, me too.
So Shadi, what story did you read, Shadi? You were also read Monster Slayer.
Yeah, Monster Slayer, the Yinsu.
Okay. So two of you read about monster slayers and yeah. Okay. It seems like too, I mean, a number of these stories came out of the creation story. They're part of that overall saga, which, as you know, is a big story, a big book, actually, the Dini Bahane. And so these are pieces of it you've read that are coherent stories. And it does seem like monsters play a role in this. And it's, let's see. Others? A number of you read about Spider Woman or Changing Woman, and I wonder how they play in this. Savannah, you had some interesting things to say about yours.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because it was about, honestly, the beginning part I like read through fast, so I just remember it was about Spider Rock, and then Spider Woman came out of somewhere.
Okay.
And then like I don't like, yeah, that part is a blur, but I know that the end was about it was like Spider Woman was terrorizing kids and eating, not terrorizing, but like kids were having nightmares because of like of folk tales that Spider Woman like ate children or killed them from like her web.
Yeah.
And then there was this youth that like this guy that was being chased, and she ended up saving him by like putting her web down, and then like he like crawled up it, and then he went back to like the village and was like, Spider Woman saved me. And I thought it was pretty interesting that like something so like bad and portrayed as something like mean then was like something portrayed as something good.
Well, that's very interesting because, yeah, you have Spider Woman here. I've just put it up on the screen, and this is kind of retold. Spider Woman loved the people, and so she gave power to Monster Slayer and Child Born of Water to search for the sun god who was their father. And then when they find him, he shows them how to destroy all the monsters. But then because she preserved her people, the Dine established Spider Woman among their most important and honored deities. So here, yeah. Her husband, Spider-Man, constructed the weaving loom, making the cross poles of sky and earth cords to support the structure, the warp sticks of sunrays. All this about weaving, right? It's all this connection with the loom. And so this is how also explains how they become weavers. And then if children don't behaved themselves, Spider-Woman will let down her web and carry them up to her home and devour them. So she does form this warning to you. And the top of the spider rock was white from the sun-bleached bones of the Dine children who did not behave themselves. So it's a good warning to children. And then one day, then this is the story you have, the youth was hunting in Dead Man's Canyon, and then suddenly he saw an enemy tribesman chased him deep into the canyon. And as this peaceful Dine ran, he looked quickly from side to side, looking for a place to hide or escape. Directly in front of him stood the giant obelisk-like spider rock. And so he climbs a silken cord that's suddenly hanging down the rock. And he wraps it around, ties it around his waist and climbs the tower. And there Spider Woman has rescued him and shows him how she made her strong web cord. And then, yeah. It's a great story. Because here you have this person everyone is afraid of, this being everyone is afraid of. We have to remember not to call them persons, but yeah. Okay. I think each story too, we can
I did
break
have a
down.
question about
Yes.
the weaving part. I
Yes.
do remember like reading that part now, but for some reason I forgot about it. Like after hearing you talk about stuff in the beginning of class, but does that kind of relate to dream catchers?
I would imagine. What do you know about dream catchers?
I've always had dream catchers since I was young. My first one I think I actually got in Arizona, but when I was like 7. I know that like legend, I read about them so much because my grandmother gets them for free from like a charity.
Okay.
So she always gives me them.
Well,
Well,
that would
no,
be
that's not the ones that I have, but
okay. Yeah. Well, it will be something to look into. Because this is something
yeah.
that's really essential to the Navajo. So why is there this weaving that, and these are
Yeah.
very much a Southwestern.
The like weaved web of the dream catchers like
Yeah.
lets the good dreams float through, and then the bead means something special, but I like dream catchers.
Okay, well, that's good. Anyone else have any familiarity with dream catchers? Okay, we're all learning.
I feel like I don't really have any like nightmares as much with them.
Well, that's good. That's good. They work. Good.
What are dream catchers?
What are dream catchers? Do you have one you can show us?
Not right now. I'm not in my room, but
Okay.
it's a circular thing with like it looks like it has a web on it, a weaved web, and then usually there's beads, and it has like the feathers hanging down.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And you hang it
Have
up?
you seen them?
I think I've heard of it, and then like, what does it do? Does it protect you or something?
It's supposed to like usually they put it above like your like a child's bed, like usually baby, but it's like that. I don't remember like the legend part, but I know that it's supposed to like protect over people like when they're sleeping, so like the bad dreams get like caught in the web and the good dreams or something like that.
Interesting.
It like protects you in your sleep from bad dreams.
Interesting. Okay. So we found out about warriors being valued and about these, there seem to be a lot of monsters in the stories too. I mean, and Spider Woman may or may not be one, but anyone else come across anything interesting in their story? Yes, Lucy.
So the story that Jeffrey and I read was, it's so simple, I don't know how, Night Chant, I keep forgetting the name, Night Chant. And it's basically this oh my gosh, it's late. This origin story of one of the, I guess, principal Navajo prayer ceremonies called the Night Chant. And yes, excellent. I think we both found that there was an emphasis on animals and animals being in holy positions or being like representative of holy beings, because initially 2 people kill birds and those birds end up being holy people. And then when this one guy gets taken into this big prayer ceremony, everybody who's there is like a god or a deity and is wearing like an animal mask. So I don't know. We didn't really know what that meant.
Let's see. Here's the story. It's on my screen. 3 brothers lived among their people who were known as the Dine. Their oldest brother was rich. The second was a gambler, and the youngest was a growing boy. Their only sister was married and lived a distance from her brothers with her husband. And the second brother often took property belonging to his brothers and went to distant corners of the earth to gamble. And then when he came back, he would tell stories about the holy people who had revealed many interesting things to him. And they never believed him. They called him the dreamer. And one day they wanted to go hunting, but they did not want the dreamer to go with them. Without telling him, they asked their brother-in-law to go with them. And the 4th day away from home, the dreamer suddenly realized he had been tricked. So he set out in search of the hunters. He hoped to meet them and to help them carry their game, and also to be rewarded by a pelt or 2. He traveled far, but he had not seen them when the sun passed behind the hills in the distance. Near him was a deep rock-walled canyon. from the depths of which came the sound of many voices. He walked to its edge and peered over, and then there were countless crows flying over it. They passed in and out of holes in opposite walls. When darkness had covered everything, the dreamer heard a human voice call from below in loud tones. They say, they say, they say. From the far side came the answer. Yes, yes, what's the matter now? 2 people were killed today, the voice replied. Who were they? Who were they? You can hear how this really is echoing the sound crows make. If you've ever heard crows cawing, they say, they say. And then, who were they? Who were they? And the first voice answered, Anahelihi killed at sunrise. Igakiji killed at dusk by the people of the earth. They went in search of meat. Hunters shot arrows into them. We are sorry, but they were told to be careful and did not heed. It is too late to help them now. Let us go on with the chant. So here the crows are reporting that people had come and hunted and killed 2 of their number by shooting arrows into them. So the dreamer becomes very frightened, but he stays to listen and watch, and muffled strains of song came from deep recesses in each canyon wall. The gods are singing, and just within the openings, visible in the glow of a fire, many dancers are performing in unison as they kept time with rattles. Throughout the night, firelight flickers from wall to wall, singing and dancing continue. At daylight, the dancers depart, and the dreamer again begins to search for the hunters. After a short time, he reaches his brothers. They're resting from their journey with heavy packs of game. Here comes the dreamer, says the older brother. I'll wager he has something marvelous to tell us. The dreamer was greeted first by his brother-in-law. You must have slept near here last night, for you were too far from home to have traveled this distance since daylight. I slept near a canyon that is surely holy, replied the dreamer. Many people had gathered to dance. The gods sang, and there, I told you he'd have some lie to tell, interrupted the oldest brother, and he picks up his pack and starts to walk away. Go ahead, urged the brother-in-law. Tell me the rest. The younger brother, also not believing, took up his pack and walked on. As the brother-in-law looked interested, the dreamer related all that he had seen and heard. You or my brothers must have killed the people they spoke about, said the dreamer as he ended his story. Oh no, his brother-in-law replied. It was none of us. We've killed no people. Yesterday morning, one of us shot a crow, and last night we killed a magpie, but there was no harm done. I fear there was, said the dreamer. They are hunters like you in search of meat for the holy people. At the time, they were disguised as birds, the dreamer explained. The 2 men overtook the others. The youngest brother asked his brother-in-law, Did you hear a fine story? It was not a lie, he retorted. We killed a crow and a magpie yesterday, and the holy people talked about it in the canyon last night. Look, here come 4 mountain sheep. So initially, we have, this is a fascinating story, and I'm sorry now to retell it, but you have the 3 brothers, and you've had their characters, and then the brother-in-law, and the 2 brothers, brother-in-law set out to go hunting, and the dreamer follows them, and he sees this scene with the crows who've also turned into people, and they're dancing. And then he hears from them this story, and then he meets his brothers and brother-in-law, and 2 of them don't believe him. The one hears the story and begins to believe. The 2 others have walked away. You have a couple of things happening here. There is whatever is happening among the crows. That is one story, but then you have this overall narrative with these brothers explaining this. And you see it is this connection. The holy people also include the crows and the magpies, and they become people. That is, the dreamer saw them dancing as people, and he thought they were gods. And the 2 brothers still don't believe. Do you think the brother-in-law believes him at this point?
I don't know. The whole thing is kind of weird because we were talking, there was like the significance of the 2 brothers and then the stepbrother, but then like the stepbrother never really comes back, and neither does the older brother. Then the younger brother comes back, and we couldn't really tell if there was significance behind like the
It's a
family relation
brother-in-law.
there, or
Well,
if
it's the
like the stepbrother
brother-in-law.
would be rewarded because he was listening to him.
No,
It was
he's not a
weird. Or
stepbrother. He's a
brother-in-law.
brother-in-law. Yeah. Yeah. So
complicated relation.
It is
Yes,
a
that's what I
complicated
meant.
relationship. You know, the two brothers won't believe him, but the brother-in-law will, as he is telling this story. Do you believe this story? You or Jeffrey? Maybe you think,
No,
why not? He
I
saw
don't.
it.
You saw it.
Yeah.
Oh, do you mean like, do I believe if he's telling the truth?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, oh, sure, why not? I mean, I don't know his motivation to lie. And then you miss like the whole part where he turns into a sheep later. Like
Yeah,
it
we're
gets
about to get
crazy.
to that part because
So,
that seems to be the next part of the story involving sheep. So let's continue on to the sheep. We wouldn't want anyone to miss the end of the story. Okay, so they overtook the others and 4 mountain sheep. Hurry and head them off. They reached the canyon where the strange voices had been heard. 4 sheep along large boulders were carefully threading their way out of the canyon. The 3 hunters drop back. The dreamer runs ahead and hides himself near the top of the trail. As the sheep approach, he draws his bow and aims for the leader's heart. His fingers would not release their grip on the arrow. The sheep passed unharmed. He scrambled up over the rim of the canyon and ran to get ahead of them again. But when the sheep were passing him, the bowstring would not leave his fingers. A third effort to kill them failed, and a fourth effort. Okay, so you have, and by the way, if you were telling this story, you could elaborate on it. Each time you could tell the story about he draws his bow, but his fingers won't release their grip. That is, he's trying to kill these sheep, but he cannot. And he curses himself and the sheep, but suddenly became quiet. Whom did he see but 4 gods, the 4 who had transformed themselves into sheep? So here, these are sheep who transform themselves into gods. The previous night, he saw birds transforming themselves into gods. And then, so these 4 gods now wear masks, and he asks where they came from. The leader replies, "Where are you going?" "To hold another chant 4 days from now. Won't you come along?" He says, "No, I couldn't travel so far in 4 days." But after a little persuasion, he agrees to go. He was told to disrobe. And while he's obeying the order, the leader breathes on him. His raiment became the same as that of the 4 gods. They all took 4 steps eastward, changed into sheep, and bounded away along the canyon's rim. So meanwhile, the 3 brothers, the 2 brothers and the brother-in-law, are hiding. They become restless because he doesn't return. So they go out where they could see the trail on which they had last seen him. No one was in sight. One of them went to the rock where the dreamer first hid near the sheep. He followed the tracks from hiding place to hiding place until he reached the last one. There he found his brother's clothes and his bow and arrow. He traced the 4 human footsteps to the east, found they merged into the trail of 5 mountain sheep. The oldest brother cried in his remorse. He had always treated the dreamer with scorn, but now he realized he had been wrong. So the gods and the dreamer, transformed into mountain sheep, traveled very far during their 4 days' journey. On the 4th day, they came to a large hogan, an earth-covered lodge of the Diné. Inside are numerous holy people, gods and men. So the dreamer enters the hogan with his 4 holy companions, and a complaint at once arose from those inside about an earthly odor. The leader of the 5 who had just arrived took the dreamer outside and had him washed with yucca root suds. Inside the hogan stood 4 large jewel posts upon which the gods hung their masks. The eastern post of white shell, the southern of turquoise, the western of abalone, and the northern of jet. 2 jewel pipes lay beside a god sitting on the western side of the hogan. He filled both pipes with tobacco, lighted them, passed one to his right and one to his left. All the hogan smoked. The last to receive the pipes were 2 large owls, sitting on each side of the entrance to the east. Each smoker drew in deep draughts of smoke and puffed them out violently. While the smoking continued, people came in from all directions. At midnight, lightning flashed, followed by heavy thunder and rain. All were sent by Water Sprinkler, who was angered because he had not been told about the dance before it began. But a smoke with the holy people quickly appeased him. In a short time, the chant began and lasted until morning. Some of the gods had beautiful paintings on white deer skins, resembling those of the Dine, those the Dine now make with colored sands. They unfolded them on the floor of the Hogan during days of the chant. The last day of the dance was well attended. People came from all directions, and throughout the performance, the dreamer paid careful attention to all the songs, prayers, paintings, and he learned all the details of the ceremony. The gods permitted him to return to his people long enough to perform the chant with his younger brother and to conduct it for people afflicted with illness or with sickness. They spent 9 days in its performance. Then he returned to the gods where he now lives. His younger brother taught the ceremony to his earthly brothers, the Dine. They conducted under the name of the Night Chant, or the chant of the paternal gods. So this is a story that has a lot going on, as you can see. And I'm sorry for having taken over the interpretation of it. But you have these gods who turn into animals, into birds, into sheep. And then the dreamer is this character who brings the night chant to the Dine from the gods. And you have the gods, there's anger among the gods. Water Sprinkler hadn't been invited to the dance, but then, this is how we know about the night chant, because of Dreamer, who is the, he's not, again, it shows something about the roles of people in this society. Dreamer isn't the one you would, rely on if you needed someone to go hunting. He's just always wandering around dreaming and gambling, but then he is the one who's able then to make this transition into the sheep and following the gods along. And then he gets there and the gods say he smells, basically, and so they have to wash him with yucca root, but then teach him this chant that comes about with smoking tobacco. It is in many ways an origin story to them. Yes, Trevor, you're raising your hand.
Kind of not like on topic, but the concept of a gambler just kind of surprised me. I guess I just pictured that they were more of like a community-based economy with more like bartering. I know wampum was a thing, but like I didn't know if that was all tribes or how it kind of worked, how they bought things.
Well, not to be stereotypical, but the Indians typically do gamble a lot. It's about all kinds of things, games and sports and gambling. It's not necessarily betting on the outcome of a game, but games are very important. And they invent a couple of games, like lacrosse was an Indian game, and they would play lacrosse for days. And then other kinds of gambling, have a rock painted different colors. One side is black, one side's white, and you gamble which side is going to land. It will land white side up or black side up. And other kinds of games like that, where there's a lot of gambling involved. It's one reason, actually, why we've had bingo, casinos, and so on, really emanating from Indian reservations, is because of gambling being an important thing. But here you can see, here's the story of the Navajo, and there is this character who is this guy is a gambler, and then someone else read the story of the gambler. I'll be embarrassed if it was you, Trevor, and I didn't write it down. No, someone read the gambler. Alessandro, you read the gambler. Is Alessandro still with us?
I'm ready.
What's going on with that story, Alessandro?
Do you mean like somewhat of a summary of this?
Yeah.
So basically from what I got from it was that this tribe of Native Americans, they interacted with this sort of gambling god, yes, and they would bet away pretty much everything, and the gambling god could not really be defeated, and eventually people ended up gambling themselves, and then they became his slaves, and then the sons and daughters of those people tried to win their parents back, and they also just got added to his collection, basically.
Wow.
And honestly, it was kind of like a story. I remember, I forget if I read this incorrectly, something about the Navajo only being spectators up until the very end, where they actually did interact with him. And, yeah.
I see. Yeah, so this divine gambler comes from, okay. A lot of these stories, it's, it's an interesting story because you do have it is a way, you know, why there's gambling, the two great shells and the chips. I'll bet myself against yourself, and this is yeah, okay, good. Anything further you want to add to the story, Alessandro?
Nothing really I want to add to it. It was honestly pretty interesting to me. That's kind of all I can really say else about it.
Okay, good, good. Would you recommend it?
Sorry, I'm having trouble with my mute
Okay,
button.
okay,
Yeah. No, I would recommend it. It's pretty compelling.
okay, good. Good. Anyone else want to tell us about their story?
I was kind of skimming through mine, but it's confusing. So can you talk about it a little bit with
And what is your story?
the changing woman and like how that guy like comes to her bed and stuff, and then she gets like pregnant and has like bad or like monster children or something? I don't know if I read that right.
Well, Changing
Or,
Woman is
I don't
kind
know.
of she is one of the archetypal figures in among the Navajo. Let me see if I can find that one here.
Well, they're saying like towards the end, like maybe it's a story like her dad and mom are earth and wind or something. I don't
Yeah,
know.
it was also in the Monster Slayer story. She's like the mother of two monster sons. Their father is apparently the sun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she is one of the central figures in the Navajo cosmology, um, the changing woman. In fact, there's a novelist named Tony Hillerman who has written. He has a whole series about a Navajo detective, and he deals a lot with the Navajo cosmology. That is the relationship between the gods and people, and yeah, and one thing you're seeing in all of these stories is it's not a strict boundary between gods and people. They move back and forth. There is something of this. And all of these stories do tell us something about these different characters. So, Birth of the Changing Woman was planned by First Man and First Woman. And First Man repeatedly held up his medicine bundle toward Gouverneur de Nob at dawn, and that's the east. And somewhat from this action, Changing Woman was born, found lying on top of the knob, and she was found by Talking God, who was sent to investigate. That is, as with the ancient Greeks, you have a lot of these characters in this story, different gods. And first man isn't necessarily a man, but is the first person, because the holy people are the Dine, and they are the Navajo. But then you have these other characters who existed before, in a similar way to the way the Greek gods existed before there were people. And so Changing Woman is born, and this is a child of the young man and the young woman of exceeding beauty who had themselves arisen from the same medicine bundle to become the inner form of the earth. And you can see there's this little blurb at the top that tells us about Changing Woman is really something like the personification of the earth and of the natural order of the universe. So again, what this story and other of the creation stories are trying to do is make sense of something that is really to us people unfathomable. That is, how was the world created? How are we created? And so we have these people who were involved in it who may or may not be people like us. So she grows from infancy to puberty in 4 days. And this gives her the name Changing Woman. And the first puberty ceremony, which is still something that young girls would go through. And the holy people were called for, and Talking God officiates at the ceremony. She's dressed in jewels, white shell, turquoise, abalone, and jet. Now, you'll recall from the previous story that white shell, turquoise, abalone, and jet, these 4 basic elements, are, at the poles in this hogan of the holy people. And then blessed with pollen. Again, pollen is a sacred thing, pollen coming from flowers and plants. And from the dawn and from twilight, you have east and west, the dawn and twilight being really important things. And with pollen, many jewels, a soft fabric symbolizing her control over these articles. After this blessing, her hair was bathed with dews. She was instructed to run toward the dawn as far as she could see and then return. As she ran, her dress of jewels jingled. She repeated this for 4 nights. On these days, when not involved in ceremony, she occupied herself with planning for the future of the earth. By the end of the ceremony, she had made millstones, a whisk broom, pots, stirring sticks. The songs that were sung for Changing Woman as she ran are sung today for young women at their puberty ceremonies. By the way, this is not that much different from other Native American ceremonies involving this particular change. You have the Iroquois, who have Sky Woman, who falls to earth and then puts earth on the back of a turtle and then walks around the turtle in the direction of the sun rising and setting, and this makes the earth grow. And she has brought down seed. So you have the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. You have these sacred elements, and then you have Changing Woman running toward the ceremony. And then another ceremony the next time she menstruates. And after this ceremony, she goes outside, walks on a trail which had been prepared for her. A strange man walks up to her and speaks to her. He says, "Prepare yourself for something that is going to happen. After a while, I will visit you." The stranger was so dazzling, Changing Woman has to look away. When she turns back, he is gone. She returns home, reports this encounter to First Woman and First Man. It seems that First Man was expecting this occurrence, which happened twice again. And the third time, Changing Woman told to fix her bed outside with her head to the east. Okay, so a young man comes, lays beside her. This happens again. She asks who he was. He says, "Don't you know me? Don't you ever see me? Don't you know you see me all the time? It is I that take care of all things, wherever there is on earth. I am the sun's inner form." Okay, so Changing Woman is really a personification of the earth, and this young man is the personification of the sun. And it is the earth and the sun that make things grow. And then the next day she bathes, and while bathing, the young man appears again, and she becomes pregnant. And then in 9 days, her twins are born. Now remember, First Man and First Woman are not really her parents in the sense that, you know, you have parents, but they are, they had created her from this bundle of medicine. And now she gives birth to these twins, and the twins become Monster Slayer and Born for Water. And they grow in 4 days. And in 12 days, they're grown men. Now, at this point, Changing Woman asks for and receives the medicine bundle that First Man had brought up from the previous worlds. Now, remember, the story of the Navajo is that they emerged from these 3 other worlds to the current world, the 4th world, the world where we're in now. And so this medicine bundle had been brought up from the previous world. And then she moves to a hogan built for her at the base of Orfano Mountain. And here she conducts the first wedding ceremony, which is the mating of the corn. And after this ceremony, she leaves for the house that her sons have built for her in the direction of their father, the sun, in the west, or at the Pacific Ocean. So she goes to the place where the sun goes down, because that's where the sun will be every day. And here Changing Woman grows lonely. And so because she's lonely, she creates the Navajo people. So this is how the Navajo people, the Dine, come into being. The 4 pairs of people created at this time are the ancestors of all Navajo today. And Changing Woman also causes the abduction of the 2 children of Rock Crystal Talking God. They were taken to her house in the west by way of a rainbow and a sunbeam. And here they were taught the Blessing Way ceremony. And they return home to teach the ceremony to all of their people, very much the way the dreamer in the previous story came back to teach the Night Chant to the people. That is, we have all of these ceremonies, and they were given to us by Changing Woman or the dreamer who met with these gods who are also animals. And so She's teaching the Navajo children all of these ceremonies. They gather to learn the ceremony and to construct the original mountain soil bundle containing soil from each of the sacred mountains. That is the 4 mountains that form the boundaries of the Navajo country with which the ceremony is still conducted. The holy people then said that after the departure from this ceremony, they would never be seen in person again, but their presence would be manifest in the sound of the wind, the feathers of an eagle, in various birds, in the growth of the corn and other aspects of the world surrounding the earth surface people. So the earth surface people, of course, are the Dine. The 2 children who had been taught the blessing way ceremony then departed to live with the holy people. So this is the story of changing woman. And you can see it's annotated. Does that make it more clear, Sana? Or more baffling?
No, it makes sense. It's kind of like the American way of Adam and Eve, right?
Well, the Navajo. I mean, again, Adam and Eve is a way of understanding how all of this happened. And so other creation stories or similar ways of explaining this phenomena that we really can't otherwise understand. And so this is a way, if you read the entire Dine Bahane and the other stories, you will get an account of how these things came into being. Someone was comparing this to Aesop's fables, which also is a way of trying to explain things. But I think it was Tessa who said it was kind of a different twist because no one dies at the end of many of the stories that you read here. They seem to have happier endings. Tessa, you and Patrick read Rainbow's End. Do you want to say a few words about that while we have a few minutes? Are you still there? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we both kind of interpreted it in a different way, but it does kind of go with a lot of the other stories that we were talking about. Like it's a lot of the same characters in them, but basically it's like 2 twins who are children of the sun and the water, and they're on a search for their father. And Patrick was kind of saying that it could have been interpreted as like the Navajo tribe looking for like the best place to like stay, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of interpreted it as like they're searching for like their heaven. So yeah.
That's interesting. Okay. Yeah. Most stories do involve some kind of a search. It makes it for an interesting story anyway. And again, it gets to a question we have when we're interpreting any kind of a narrative like this. What is it they're looking for? Is it, one of the big themes in most of the religious traditions with which I'm familiar is that it's to try to attempt to reconnect with the divine. And so here you can see that they are trying to find where they're going to live, or they're trying to find this concept of the divine, which we've been separated from. And with the Navajo, you have this really permeable line between the gods and us, even though you've come through these different worlds. And the worlds are filled with monsters and with strange, in some cases, evil beings. I mean, many of these stories are trying to account for that problem of why do you have evil in the world? And how do you deal with these things? So the stories like this typically do explain the world we live in and how it came to be, and also how we can cope with it. As one of the earlier stories we read about Spider Woman, and it's a warning that if you misbehave, she's going to take you up to the top of the mountain where she lives and eat you. That's a pretty severe threat, but then there are other real threats here. So those are both good interpretations for this. I mean, we're all looking for something, and what is it? And these stories really do in different ways reflect that we know we emerge from these 3 other worlds, and then Sky Woman is living in the turquoise house, but here you see she's living in the turquoise house, but she's lonely, and that's why she creates people. there probably are other stories too. There are other stories too about how the people get created. This seems, the most plausible one to me. It's because Sky Woman is lonely, but again, she's not. People are not her children, but they are her creation. In the same way, she is not the children of first man and first woman. She is the creation of them through this medicine bundle. I'm sorry, Tessa, you were doing a good job explaining this before I started a monologue of misinterpretation.
No, that's okay. It makes sense, everything you were saying.
Patrick, do you have anything to add?
Not particularly, no.
Okay. Let's see, Molly, you read about Coyote helping to create man, and Coyote, as I think I said, was the trickster. Can you tell us anything more about that story?
Yeah, so the story is basically about so there was, in the beginning, the legend says that the great grandfather spirit, which, like, from what I understand is essentially like their version of God, had just finished creating Earth and like all the animals that lived on Earth. And he was pretty happy what he had done. But the animals started fighting over like who was going to be in charge. And the coyote wasn't like into fighting at all. And so he asked the grandfather spirit to make a man and a woman to rule over all of the animals on Earth. And then the spirit used his magic to turn Coyote into a man, and then he made a woman out of the earth. And I thought this was pretty interesting because, like, if you think about like other religious contexts, like in Catholicism, where like before Adam and Eve existed, all the animals were there, and then there was a snake, and then the snake was kind of the reason that humankind started. So it's like essentially the story of creation in
It is, yeah.
Navajo legend.
Yeah. So it's interesting that Coyote becomes a man, and Coyote does appear in other stories as this trickster character. Does anyone know anything, by the way, about coyotes generally? How are they regarded in terms of the animal kingdom?
All I know about coyotes is they eat little dogs in California.
They do. Well, anywhere, yes, they do eat little dogs and cats and all, yeah. Anything else? I mean, coyotes in popular... Yes, Trevor?
Aren't they kind of like more like scavenger dogs, kind of like they pick at bones and stuff?
Yeah, they do, yeah. The coyotes aren't...
Travel in packs?
West Savannah, yeah, they do travel in packs often. Yeah, they are wild dogs. I mean, and so they have the same DNA as other canines. Other coyotes in popular culture, anyone is familiar with? Yes, Trevor.
Wile
E. Coyote, exactly. It is Wile E. Coyote who is always trying to catch the roadrunner. He has various I don't know if Wile E. Coyote is related to the Navajo Coyote, who is the trickster, who sometimes helps out. And this was an interesting story because he is responsible then for getting people created. And there's another story in which the Coyote discovers that all the people have been swallowed up by a giant. And so he starts cutting out chunks of the giant's stomach to feed these people who are starving because they're inside this giant. And then he manages to trick the giant into expelling all of the people. That's another story here. Coyote kills a giant is story number 2 on the list I've given you. But yeah, that's an interesting thing. And again, all of these animals do have their place in this creation and are able to move back and forth between the world of gods and the world of people. We saw the crows who become people and are performing this dance, and then the sheep who become gods. And Dreamer is able to become a sheep and then move in with the gods and then comes back to tell us these ways of these ritual, the Night Chant, or which apparently is a healing ceremony. That is, we have these ceremonies we perform, and these stories tell us why we perform them. So I think I'm actually going to sit here for the rest of the night talking about these stories, telling them to myself, but I know you all have lives to get back to. I've posted on the Blackboard site a place where you can put your comments, your reflection on the story you read, and then comment on others too, so that we can continue this engagement with trying to understand the Navajo by understanding their stories. Okay, so I will let you go at this point, and we'll all change back into whatever other form we wanted, and we'll continue next week. So I will see you then.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.